My name is Rachel Lynn. I'm a systems analyst, which means I usually stay behind the scenes solving problems most people never even notice. But on that Friday afternoon, as I stood outside the glass doors of the Westbridge Hotel ballroom, I realized just how invisible I had become. The woman at the check-in table didn't even look up when I gave my name. She just flipped a clipboard and said the words that hit harder than I expected. No seat available. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her right. I pointed at my name printed clearly on the program in her hands. She shrugged, motioned to the side, and went back to her list. Inside, I could see the glittering lights of the ballroom, the clinking of wine glasses, and the soft sound of laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. I stood there in a navy dress I'd picked carefully that morning, trying to believe this was a mistake. Then I saw her. Jenna. The intern who'd joined barely 2 months ago. She was already walking up to the stage, her heels clicking confidently on the polished floor, holding the exact presentation I had spent my last 3 weekends building. The title slide was still mine. Even the color scheme, the data sets, the predictive flow model, they were mine. I could feel something in my chest pull tight. My breathing went shallow as applause erupted around her. And just like that, she was holding the plaque I should have received. Innovation of the Year, they called it. Based on work I had created alone off the clock after hours because I believed in it. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just stood there hearing nothing except the dull hum in my ears. Like when you're underwater and someone shouts from the surface. Someone nearby tried to wave me off kindly like I'd gotten lost or misunderstood. But I hadn't misunderstood a thing. I had never been lost. I was erased. The worst part wasn't the stolen credit. It was how easy it was for them to pretend I had never existed. That I had never stayed late, never tested dozens of model versions, never pitched in those first scrappy internal meetings when no one even cared what logistics meant. Now someone else stood in the spotlight smiling over words she hadn't written, graphs she hadn't built, and a future she hadn't earned. I turned away before they could see my face. Not because I was ashamed, but because I needed a moment. A moment to decide what came next. Because whatever this was, it wasn't the end of the story. I grew up in a town so small we didn't have traffic lights, just a blinking stop sign by the grocery store. My mom was the high school math teacher, and my dad ran the post office out of a one-room building where everyone left their packages on a folding table. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. People worked hard and expected their effort to mean something. That was the world I carried with me when I moved to the city after graduation. I still remember the first time I saw the lobby of Alex Logistics. Glass walls, polished concrete floors, the smell of fresh coffee and ambition. It felt like a place where ideas mattered. They hired me as a junior systems analyst, and I dove in head first. I spent late nights running simulations, optimizing delivery zones, and streamlining returns. It wasn't glamorous, but it made things better. That's what I loved. The numbers didn't lie. When something worked, you saw it. In savings, in faster deliveries, in fewer complaints. During my first year, I built a tracking model that reduced inventory loss by 12%. A manager from procurement emailed to thank me, saying no one had ever figured out how to make that process flow. Another time, a regional director called my code elegant, which felt like a compliment worth remembering. But those things stayed small. A thank you here, a compliment in passing. When it came time for recognition for awards or promotions, those went elsewhere. I didn't think much of it then. I wasn't the kind of person who chased praise. I believed in results, not applause. So, I kept working, quietly, steadily. I thought that if I just kept showing up, if I made myself indispensable, the rest would follow. I pictured myself moving up, leading projects, mentoring new hires. Not because I played office politics, but because I earned it. People around me seemed to rise faster. Louder voices, sharper elbows. They had brunches with directors and posted wins on LinkedIn with 100 likes before lunch. I didn't mind. I figured we all had our own way. Mine just took longer. And honestly, I liked the work too much to step away from it. There was always another problem to solve, another system to fix. Still, I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting a little. Watching someone else get credit for an idea you helped shape. Or sitting through a presentation knowing your models were behind the numbers flashing on the screen while your name never got mentioned. But I told myself it was okay, that it didn't matter who stood at the podium as long as the company grew stronger, as long as the work made a difference. Back then, I still believed that being good at your job was enough, that the system, as flawed as it sometimes seemed, would recognize effort in the end. It never occurred to me that some systems are built to overlook people like me, quiet people, focused people, the ones too busy doing the work to stop and sell it. I wasn't bitter, not yet. I still had hope. I still thought the next project, the next quarter, the next leadership shuffle would bring change. It wasn't until much later that I realized I'd been waiting for a door that was never meant to open for me. Dominic had only been at the company for a few weeks when I first met with him. He seemed sharp, confident, the kind of leader who asked a lot of questions and kept his eyes moving. I liked that. I thought maybe he'd bring fresh energy, maybe even notice the work that often went unseen. So when I finished developing a new model to predict supply chain delays based on weather patterns, I set up a one-on-one to walk him through it. He listened, nodding, often scribbling notes that looked more like doodles than strategy. Still, he asked good follow-ups and told me it was exactly the kind of innovation the company needed. I left that meeting feeling optimistic. Finally, maybe this time, someone in leadership saw what I could bring. 2 weeks later, I watched him present my model to the executive board like it was his. He used the same visuals, the same language. He even told a little story I had shared about tracking port congestion using satellite data. But there was no mention of me. Not once. I sat there frozen, unsure of what to feel. Part of me wanted to believe it was a simple mistake. Maybe he forgot. Maybe in front of the board, things moved too fast. Maybe. After the meeting, I approached him gently, casually, not wanting to seem defensive. I thanked him for including the model and mentioned how great it was to see leadership so engaged. He looked up from his laptop, half distracted, and said it had been a team effort. Then he added almost offhandedly that I had helped with some of the numbers, but the core concept was his. I didn't know what to say. I nodded, smiled, even told myself it wasn't worth making a scene. I figured if I kept contributing, kept improving, it would balance out eventually. Maybe he just needed more time to see the whole picture. Maybe I just needed to keep proving myself. It was easier to believe that than to admit the truth. That I had just been erased in plain sight, and I had let it happen. It didn't just happen once. And after that first meeting with Dominic, I started noticing the pattern. Every time I brought him a solution or a new idea, it found its way into some presentation or update without my name anywhere near it. Sometimes he changed the formatting. Sometimes he altered the phrasing. But the core stayed the same, and it was always presented as his. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe I was just being sensitive. Maybe that's how things worked in big companies where managers took the lead and the team stayed in the background. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. The reports, the dashboards, even the slide decks I designed late at night, I carefully labeled each section. They all reappeared days later with his voice behind them. When I finally worked up the nerve to speak with HR, I came in with emails, version histories, and timestamps. The woman behind the desk barely looked up. She asked if I had developed the material during work hours. I said yes. Then she asked if I had used company equipment. I said of course. She nodded like that settled everything. According to policy, any work created under those conditions belonged to the company. And if a department head presented it, that was considered an appropriate chain of command. When I asked what would happen if a junior staff member kept getting passed over for credit, she just shrugged and said she couldn't comment on hypotheticals. That was when it clicked. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a bad manager or an unfair decision. It was a system that rewarded loud voices and ignored quiet ones, that measured value by visibility, not substance. I walked out of that meeting not just disappointed, but disoriented. I had spent my entire career believing good work would speak for itself. Now I knew it didn't even whisper unless someone gave it a microphone, and I no longer believed anyone would hand me one. I had spent nearly every weekend that month refining the new logistics framework. It was the most ambitious model I'd ever worked on. Dynamic routing tied to real-time traffic predictive timing based on client history and layered fallback contingencies. It was clean, efficient, and potentially transformative. I tested it again and again, checking every variable until the system ran smoother than anything we'd ever deployed. I didn't build it because someone asked. I built it because I saw the gap, the inefficiencies bleeding money across our delivery network. I believed if I could just get it in front of leadership, they'd understand what it could do. Dominic knew about it. He said it was impressive. When I asked for a time slot during the quarterly strategy review, he nodded and said we'd make it fit. On the morning of the meeting, I printed handouts, ran the numbers one last time, and practiced how I'd open my pitch. 5 minutes before we walked into the boardroom, he pulled me aside and told me the agenda had shifted. Leadership was short on time. He said he'd include a summary of my work in his presentation and promised he'd highlight the key components. I hesitated. He smiled like it was no big deal. Said he'd make sure they got the gist. I handed over my folder. I sat in that room for 3 hours listening to projections, goals, and vague buzzwords about synergy. When Dominic got to my section, he flipped through 2 slides and said something about route consolidation improving efficiency. That was it. Months of work reduced to a passing sentence. No explanation of the predictive model, no mention of the dynamic load balancing or what made it different. I stared at the screen, willing him to say more. He didn't. No one in the room ever knew what had been left out, and I sat there smiling like it hadn't broken something into me. Like I hadn't just watched my biggest breakthrough disappear into silence. 3 weeks after that meeting, Jenna, the intern, stood at the front of the executive suite presenting what she called a new logistics framework. It had a new name and a slicker layout, but the mechanics were unmistakably mine. Same structure, same variables, even some of the same sample data. I watched from the back as the leadership team nodded, took notes, and praised her innovation. By the end of the week, she had been offered a full-time role with a title I'd worked years to even be considered for. Her project was greenlit, funded, and fast-tracked. Emails went out announcing her as a rising star. A new voice shaping the future of our logistics division. My voice, my framework, my seat. When I asked Dominic about it, he didn't even blink. He told me her version better aligned with strategic goals. That she had polished the pitch in a way leadership could digest. That sometimes it wasn't just about building the right thing. It was about packaging it for the right room. I stood there quiet, letting the words settle into place. Not because I agreed, because I finally understood. It had never been about the work, not the hours, not the improvements, not even the results. It was about visibility, proximity, politics. Jenna had access. I had labor. And in a place like this, only one of those ever moved you forward. I didn't argue. I didn't send another email. I didn't try to fix it. Something in me went still that day. Not broken, just done. I walked back to my desk and packed up early, not because I had somewhere else to be, but because I knew something had ended. Not just the project, not just the hope, the illusion that this place would ever see me clearly. I started small. I pulled my old project files and began organizing them by date, backing everything up twice. I created folders with timestamps, version histories, and email threads that showed when the work was done and who saw it first. Then I built a spreadsheet, not for the company but for myself. Every idea, every tool, every model I shared ended up credited elsewhere. At first it felt like self-preservation, a way to hold on to some proof that I had mattered, but it didn't stay that way for long. I thought about others, names I hadn't spoken in months. People who had left suddenly or quietly faded out of meetings they used to lead. I sent messages, casual check-ins that turned into long calls. I invited a former colleague for coffee and asked gently why she had really quit. The answers came slowly then all at once. A designer whose work had been passed off during a product launch. A project lead who had been promised a promotion only to watch someone else take the credit and the title. A strategist who left after a senior executive rewrote her entire pitch deck and presented it as his own. Different departments. Same story. There was a pattern, and it wasn't subtle. I realized what I had experienced wasn't personal. It was a culture, one that prized control over creativity and politics over people. But now, I wasn't alone. Each of those conversations left me steadier, more focused. We started sharing notes, experiences, and contacts, not to gossip, to prepare. I didn't announce anything. I didn't change my routine. I kept smiling at the right times, submitting reports on time, and nodding in meetings. But under the surface, something was shifting. I had been isolated for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be understood. Now I had a quiet network, and for the first time in years, I had a plan. I rewrote the framework from the ground up. This time, it wasn't just a model for optimizing routes. It was a full system, with adaptive forecasting, intelligent rerouting, and client behavior mapping layered into every function. I worked on it after hours on weekends, sometimes at dawn, before work. Not a single line of code touched a company server. I used my own devices, my own time, my own tools. When it was ready, I made one call. A friend of a former colleague connected me to a venture capitalist who specialized in logistics tech. I didn't pitch with desperation. I showed the results. Use cases, performance comparisons, cost savings. She listened, asked sharp questions, and by the end of the meeting, she said one sentence that made everything real. This could change the game. We agreed on a timeline. She needed a team proof of execution and legal clarity. I provided all three. Over the next few weeks, I drafted contracts for the people I trusted most. The ones who had also been passed over. Quiet builders, sharp thinkers, people who knew what it felt like to be invisible and had decided never to feel that way again. We met in cafes, co-working spaces, and even backyards. Behind the scenes, I filed paperwork, set up a holding company, secured trademarks, patented components of the system I had refined on my own. Every step, every signature, every NDA was deliberate. I didn't tell anyone at work, not one word. I showed up on time, took notes, and kept to myself, all while laying the foundation for something bigger than anything I could have done inside those walls. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't reckless. I was patient, because timing was everything. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity, proof that what I had built was worth more than the seat they never offered me. And when the right moment came, I'd be ready. Quiet power doesn't announce itself. It waits. Then it moves. I arrived early that morning, not because I had been invited to speak, but because I wanted to see their faces. I wore a navy suit, understated but crisp, and carried the same presentation folder I had used a year ago. Except this time, it wasn't for them. It was for me. I walked past the ballroom and sat in the lounge just outside the double doors, positioned where I could hear the muffled music and occasional bursts of applause. 10 minutes before the Innovation Awards ceremony was set to begin, I opened my laptop. The email was already drafted. Subject line, departure and disclosure. Attached were 8 resignation letters, mine and 7 others. A formal press release announcing the launch of our new venture, screenshots of the original frameworks I had created, version histories, internal emails, patent certificates, a timeline of events no one could spin. I hovered over the send button for exactly one breath. Then I clicked. Almost instantly, the quiet hallway lit up with the sound of phones chiming through the glass. One notification, then another, then a cascade, like dominoes falling. Inside the ballroom, heads turned. Conversations dropped. I stood up, slowly tucked my laptop under my arm, and walked away without looking back. I made it to the parking garage before my phone started ringing. First came the call from Dominic, then 2 missed calls from HR, then the CEO. I didn't answer. I wasn't interested in explanations. They had already spoken with their actions. Now finally, I had responded with mine. By the time I reached my car, I had a dozen texts waiting. One of the marketing directors asked if I could come back inside to clarify what I meant. One from the board assistants requesting a meeting, and one from an unfamiliar number offering to double whatever I had been promised elsewhere, none of them mattered. Inside that ballroom, as they opened their programs and saw Jenna's name beside the award for work I had built, they were also reading the release announcing our startup, Nexus Stratagem, a platform designed to redefine logistics forecasting. Built by the very people they had undervalued for years, backed by clients they had taken for granted. The email wasn't revenge, it was a resolution. For every night, I stayed late, every project that disappeared under someone else's name, every time I had been told to wait my turn. This was me saying I would wait no longer. Let the record show I hadn't walked away in silence. I had chosen the loudest moment to make my quietest move, and it had landed exactly where it needed to. By the time I reached the garage, my phone had rung 6 times. I let it vibrate in my bag, each buzz more desperate than the last. I was unlocking my car when I heard fast footsteps behind me. I turned to find Vincent, the company's VP, winded and flushed tie askew like he'd just sprinted down 3 flights of stairs. He called my name like it still held weight. He started talking before I could say a word. Told me the company was willing to make things right. That's what happened was a misunderstanding. That I was too valuable to lose. He said they'd double my salary, match any offer, and name a department after me if I wanted. He offered a seat at the table I had spent years waiting to be invited to. And then, with a flicker of real panic in his voice, he offered me the role of Chief Innovation Officer, reporting directly to the board. I looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, just clarity. 6 months ago, that title would have meant everything. It would have felt like recognition, like finally being seen. But now it felt like an apology written too late to matter. I told him I'd review the acquisition proposal with my team and our attorneys. But I wouldn't be returning. Not as an employee. Not even with the title they thought I wanted most. Because what I had now was worth more. At Nexus Stratagem, we built something different. A place where voices weren't just heard, they were trusted. Where ideas didn't disappear into someone else's deck. Where people didn't have to fight to be seen. I had spent too long in rooms that never saw me clearly. I wasn't stepping back into one just because they finally opened the door. Vincent stood there speechless, holding a folder that I had never opened. I got into my car, shut the door, and let the silence settle around me. Not out of spite, out of peace. I had already left that world behind, and now it was finally starting to understand what it had lost. You can wait outside. That was the first thing I said when I stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent, not because they didn't understand, but because they remembered. Some of them had been there that day. Some of them had read the story after it broke. Most had heard about it in whispers and headlines. But now, they were hearing it from me. I paused, let the words settle, not because they hurt anymore, but because I wanted them to land differently this time. Not as dismissal, but as recognition. Those words had once shut me out of a room I helped build. Now they opened a door I had created on my own terms. And this time, the room was mine. I told them about the framework, about the data, about the nights I worked until sunrise, and the mornings I showed up pretending I wasn't exhausted. I told them about the people who stood beside me when it mattered most. The team that had once been overlooked was now redefining an entire industry. But more than that, I told them the truth I had learned the hard way. Waiting for validation in a place that doesn't value you is a slow kind of erasure. You fade piece by piece until you forget how bright you ever were. I had waited outside long enough. I had learned that the most powerful seat isn't the one someone saves for you. It's the one you build with your own hands, surrounded by people who see you clearly. As I looked out into the audience, I saw faces from every part of the journey. Colleagues, critics, even some from the company I left behind. They weren't looking at me with pity or disbelief. They were listening. And for the first time, I wasn't asking to be included. I was inviting them to imagine what it feels like when your worth is no longer tied to someone else's permission. When I stepped off that stage, I wasn't thinking about revenge or redemption. I was thinking about the next room we'd build. One where no one ever hears those words again. You can wait outside, not because they're never spoken, but because we're done waiting. We're already inside.